Thank you for joining us. We do gender programming all around the world, and I'd like to thank the men in the audience here. If you'd all raise your hands, I think we have actually a better representation of men than usual around this topic. And I think one of the challenging things is why we're still talking about this in 2018. I mean, if you think about the speed with which other things get solved, as an example, in the United States, where I'll speak largely from, coming from there, 4 people died from contaminated romaine, and you cannot get any romaine lettuce in the entire country. Yet people are massacred every day through gun violence, and nobody seems to do anything about that. This issue around gender, half the population, half the talent pool, and yet we're still looking at enormous gaps in equality and wages, even today. So I'll start by framing it with a couple of my favorite facts. The United States Senate building did not have a ladies' room until 1992. And in the House of Representatives, where 102 women were just elected to serve, it was in 2011 that there was a ladies' room. So part of the infrastructure that is set up in corporations and governments tell you who they're expecting to come to work. And if you think about a recent rule that was just overturned last year, also in the United States government buildings, women could not wear anything that showed their shoulders nor open-toed shoes. Now that sounds kind of crazy in 2017 that there would be rules of dress, and yet it was so institutionalized that people didn't even think twice about it. So as we start to tear down these paradigms and make it other than a straight white male who's expected to come to work, we really do have a lot of work in front of us as we march towards equality. It seems so elusive despite all of the countless hours and dollars that organizations around the world have thrown at this issue. So what we're trying to do is unearth the why and then come up with some practical, tactical things that we might be thinking and doing some of that. So I want to first turn to you, Charlotte, because I know you are at Finastra monitoring some of these diversity initiatives. What do you find when you start looking at this issue around gender, and then why do women leave?
So I think what we find is that we are fantastic at the lower end of our pyramid, and as we go up, it starts to wilter away a little bit. And I think we find that for a number of different reasons. One is we just don't have the role models in the business to be able to have the sponsorship, within these individuals coming through the ranks, and also that we just haven't prepared ourselves for that. And I think, we have now got some programs that we've put in place to try and enable us to really kind of grow through those problems that we're seeing. So it's all about, and for us, it's about our CEO, Simon Paris, and our exec team living and breathing this and talking about it and continuously talking about it to try and make that change and that needle move. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And Lula, over at Egon Zehnder, are you seeing an increase from your clients' request of finding women to fill senior roles? And how do you get women into the candidate pool in the first place?
Absolutely, there's an increase, and it's very important to highlight that it's a given now. We're dealing with the top execs in the top companies globally, and the convincing is already done, so we're fine with that. Now, the practicalities of creating and finding these people, that's where the challenge lies. Some industries are much harder than others. Some functional roles are much harder than others, but at least the first step of the appetite being there, the rationale, there's no more convincing that needs to be done. We're okay with that. Mm-hmm. How do we find it? It's tricky. How do we find it is that sometimes, especially when you're looking for what we call unicorns, right? So you've got your whole list of criteria of what needs to come with this position, with this person to fill this position, and then they say, and make her a woman. Okay, great, easier said than done. So what we do go back to clients and try to educate them with is that let's look beyond just the raw competencies. Let's just look at potential. Because at Egon Zehnder, we strongly believe that what's going to really move the needle is the potential that someone brings. As important as the past and the competencies may be, and they are important and they should not be discarded, it's the forward. It's what's happening in what will likely happen in the future in this executive's career that is important. And with that, and educating our clients and really advising them as to what is relevant for them with this potential and how to interpret the potential for the role, for the job at hand, it's with that we're able to place some amazing, diverse candidates.
Okay. There was an article yesterday in Bloomberg that some of you might have seen, and the whole theme of it was that the response to the Me Too movement has been from the financial services sector to essentially avoid women at all costs. And this, don't bother, it's too much of a hassle. And actually, instructionally, people were told, don't take women out to dinner by yourself. If you're traveling with a woman on a business trip, make sure you're on different floors. I mean, the advice that was given was so counterproductive towards the advancement of people's careers. It was astonishing. And I think if that's the best we have to offer in response to that, Marianna, I want to turn to you. How do we interpret that? Like, how does the social fabric and culture inside these organizations facilitate that as a response? And this was from the financial services sector, but I would imagine that it's probably in others as well.
Okay, so the underlying principle is that women have different aspirations, that women at work are the archetypal stranger, which of course is not true because we go through the same education, we have similar dreams. Some of us want to occupy top jobs, some of us want to do other things, but there are various ways of looking at it. So there are very many willing men who would like to work with women. It's just that sometimes women don't choose male mentors, or champions within the organization. That's number one. Secondly, it starts early on in the school, in the primary school, in the academia where I'm based. Lula very correctly and Charlotte talked about role models. But actually, if you don't have many women who occupy power positions in academia, you just give a wrong message to your students. If you only see your archetypal male, yeah? And this system that actually kind of, as you just said, Richard, tries to exclude women at any cost in order to avoid trouble, it already kind of signifies that there is a trouble to be had, which actually is unfair to men and women, both, in fact. Because many men have daughters, I imagine, quite a few of you, people whom you love, who happen to be female. So I think that we can do these things together. It's not a naive view, but actually, by antagonizing and pitting men against women in organizations, everybody loses.
Mm-hmm. And I think the language that we use to talk about this is critically important. So when I think about it from the overall perspective, years ago, I think maybe 30 years ago, as this was in its nascent stages, this idea of tolerance came out, right? That is an ugly word. Like, who wants to be tolerated? I mean, it sounds almost insulting. So then it kind of moved into diversity, and we were talking about how grand the mosaic was about all our differences. And now the language is more towards inclusion. But I think that even more specific, when you counter the expected stereotype, the words that we use. So sometimes people will say a male nurse, because it's such a surprise, or a female surgeon, that's odd. It's not odd. And I think that by our common language, we don't realize how we're reinforcing that behavior and expectation. So Charlie, I want to turn to you. How do you think about messaging this, and how important is language in the way we talk about it?
I think language is very important, but I think what we have been discussing, and I think what we're all familiar with, are the symptoms of the problem. And there have been decades of discussion about that, and the frustration of the lack of progress is palpable. And I, certainly from my own experience in my last role, and from the people I've talked about, I think the argument needs to shift. I think the argument for equality is the wrong argument, and I think it's unwinnable. And I'm not talking about pay in terms of work now. I'm talking about when you're selecting a candidate and you have a group of people who, on the whole, all have the competencies, whether it's potential or whether it's actual. The reason for selecting the woman is because the woman is different, not because the woman is trying to be the best man that she can be. And I know the debate about quotas has shifted a little bit and is still a little bit controversial. But if we're going to achieve outcomes, then we need to confront that. And just one sort of parallel example, in my last firm, as it began to grow internationally, we brought in a rule, and it was an English firm, that at least 3 board seats had to be reserved for partners outside of the UK, knowing that the quality, whatever that means, of the partners in the UK was bound to be higher than the new people we were recruiting outside of the UK. But when we brought that rule in, nobody batted an eyelid. They said, of course, we must have some continental Europeans and some Asians and Americans on the board. When in my first role as leader of the firm, I stood up and said, well, 60% of the people who work in the firm are women, shouldn't we reserve some seats on the board for women? All hell broke loose, obviously. And I have reasons to prove it. But I eventually we got there. But I do think we have to move from discussion of symptoms to, in one sense, accountability and action. And I think there is an argument there. And I think the neurosciences support that.
So when we think about what governmental response has been to this issue and what can be legislated and what can't be, and you think about those countries where they've mandated certain representation on boards. In the UK now, those firms with over 250 employees, I believe, need to show their gender pay disparity. And just to clarify that issue, because I think it's confusion, when we talk about gender pay disparity, it's about if you looked at all of the men and all of the women inside of an organization and then looked at their pay in the aggregate, where is the difference? And sometimes that results because men tend to occupy the senior most well-paid positions and women are at the bottom. When we talk about equal pay, we're talking about job-specific duties and that the pay needs to be equal regardless of the person occupying the job. So just to clarify that, because in the UK I think it's the former, not the latter, that is a requirement. But how, Lula, let's go to you. Like you're kind of placing people. How effective has that been? And then also, since a lot of the kind of governmental push has been on board representation, does that really translate into a pipeline of women that can assume senior roles inside the company?
Right. So the last data that we have for board appointments is that women now occupy about 20.4 to 0.5% of all board seats globally. Okay? In the UK, that figure is actually 28%. In France, it's 42%. Okay? Now, these are countries with government intervention, with quotas, with a number of systems in place for that. And I agree with you totally, Richard, that it's not, there is still some controversy around these measures. But if we look at the flip side, there are some countries like Saudi Arabia and Hungary, closer to home and so on, where female board representation is at about 6%, okay, and they don't have quotas. But then you have Germany with quotas, or Israel or Austria, where quotas haven't really worked, okay? And this is just statistics to show that there are both arguments to be had. I think to your question, it's important, but at the end of the day, you want to come to a point of where you don't need to convince anymore, okay? And it's either government-led or internally led. And it brings us back to the actual leaders there in place. We need to go down to that very granular level and make sure that the leaders of these organizations understand the need, the business need, to have differences of opinion around their various groups, on the board level, on the exco, and pretty much across all levels of the organization, from the bottom up.
I think that's a critical point, is that there is a business rationale, and so often this initiative is captive in the human resources department, which makes it feel like a benefit, right? It's not a benefit. You're not doing people a favor by giving them a chance to equally participate. And in fact, there's demonstrable evidence that where more diverse boards are governing organizations, they yield better financial returns. So this notion of having to convince people is a little puzzling, and it leads me to think that there's a lot of unconscious bias. So one of the things that we've started doing at the Institute on hiring is that when resumes come in for positions, we actually strip out any gender identification. So there's no names, if people belong to any gender-specific type sport or organization, we take it off, and then give that to the hiring manager. So people are really being evaluated on their skills and what they bring, as opposed to anything about them. So Marianna, I want to talk about that unconscious bias because it really is a critical component. Like how do we collectively, when we go back to our organizations, like work against that?
Okay, so unconscious bias is a very natural thing. Unfortunately, we all tend to have unconscious bias. Both men and women share unconscious bias. So when I ask my students how do they imagine a leader, unfortunately, most people imagine a leader in a very specific way. In the way that you've described, Richard. So the unconscious bias has to be named, acknowledged, and there are training courses for unconscious bias. So for example, what you said is absolutely correct, that not only is there a business case, not only diverse boards or diverse organizations make better decisions. So for example, even financial decisions, over the period of 5 years, women tend to have better returns in the 5-year period, I'm saying. Why? Well, because they choose more diverse portfolio, they make less risky decision, which in a 5-year time horizon actually pays off. But also, there is less in groups that are less homosocial, by which I mean that we tend to recruit in our own image, hence the unconscious bias. We feel more safe with people who look like us, who are trained in the same institutions, who speak the same language. So acknowledging for that, most people are well-meaning. Nobody, no organization today, and I dare say, no leaders want to be associated with discriminating behavior. No, I don't believe in that. So just give people these tools, acknowledging that bias, and moreover, there is a thing called, and I'm finishing, meritocratic paradox. So self-professed egalitarians, let's say, or lefty academic, right, the self-professed egalitarians, they actually tend to even be more biased because they think that they are doing already the right thing. What is the, no, but no, honestly, this is proven by research. So what is the solution? The solution is actually to monitor regularly, to see whether we put the money where the mouth is, so to speak. So, well, I have more things to say, but anyway, I'll stop here.
I mean, I completely agree with that. And again, I would say that the fight to get rid of unconscious bias is not a fight you can ever win, because it's part of who we are as humans. And I agree with what you were saying about the boards and Mervyn Davies's report 10 years ago now, and has had good effect at the non-executive level in the UK, but hasn't had the trickle-down effect that people hoped for at the executive level, which is why every way I look at it, brings you back to quotas. Absolutely. And in the end, it's about the confidence of the organisation, the confidence of the men in, and the confidence of the women to feel that actually I have got the capability to do this job, and I am being appointed because I am different. And that is a perfectly proper reason to appoint somebody. Because we all know the debates that go on. When you're down to the last two candidates, everybody talks about who's best. And actually, if you were trying to create a diverse group or a diverse committee, you would look at your skills gap on your board or your organisation, and you would say, actually, that's a great guy, but this person here has the skills we need. It's exactly the same with women. And it's a simple point, but I think it's absolutely at the heart of making the progress that we need to make.
And I think that distance between the executive ranks and the lower levels is critical, because when you are looking up inside the organization and you see no one that looks like you, it's harder. So Charlotte, I want to talk about this notion of mentorship and sponsorship. Yeah. Tell us what you think works about that and what's challenging.
I think what's challenging is finding women to be mentors and sponsors in the organisation when you don't have as many as you need. And that's where I think, our exec team has been instrumental in taking the unconscious bias training and really wanting to be part of this and grow with the business. And so when we have, you know, predominantly a male leadership team, exec team, they still want to be mentors and still want to be sponsors and want to learn and grow with the women that are growing up within the business. And I think that is very important, and we've done a lot of work around that. I was saying to Charlie, we have a Women at Finastra group, and you know, we were sitting around the table, there's 30 of us, and our exec team came in, and predominantly they're male, and they walked into the room and were like, ah, and I said, well, this is what we do. This is what we have every day when we walk into a room. So it's just about, and I think, you know, going back to what Charlie was saying about, you know, having, you know, being accountable as an organisation and as an exec team, we are accountable to move the needle. And so therefore, we need to ensure that we are doing this in the right way and that we are all leading the charge in it. Someone who wakes up in a team of people that wake up every day and think about this, think about sponsorship, think about you know, coaching, think about training, you know, think about setting up groups across the globe with global business. If they are not thinking about it, then we are not doing it to achieve the results and the accountabilities that we need to do. And I think that is where, you know, it needs to be mandated. And like we were saying, you know, we all have, you know, we all have targets that we need to get to in the business. Why is this any different to a target that we need to have? Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I think I want to talk about this notion of kind of women's affinity groups, and
yes.
as they exist across all sorts of types of groups.
Yeah.
It seems to me that we're tasking women with solving the problem they didn't create. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure that, you know, decades later of having all the women come together and admire the problem and go back to their day jobs has been all that effective, because men are not really part of the conversation. That's really what you're trying to change.
Yeah.
So how, especially now in the advent of Me Too, that cross-gender mentorship and sponsorship,
yes.
I think is likely to be more challenging. Like, how do you think about that?
Well, so I actually, our groups, although they are women groups, they are actually, the men are totally intrigued by them. And in fact, the back row is normally filled by males in the business. So I think it's just about bringing everyone on a journey, and I think that inclusive journey that we talk about is going to be absolutely key. Which is, you know, this isn't just, and we call it Women at Finastra, but it's not just women. In fact, Craig, who's sitting in front of me, is part of the team that we do. And I think it's about bringing everyone on that journey and being clear about what we are going out to achieve and what everyone's roles and responsibilities are in that journey.
Okay. So I want to shift a little. I think that another issue that tends to come up often is that companies still see parenting as a women's issue. And as far as I know, it takes both genders to make a child. And after the birth, it's kind of open season as to who's going to take care of the child. So the gender-specific nature of that ends pretty quickly after 9 months. Yet organizations in their response, even in their benefit response, oftentimes seems to be very singly focused on the women part of that equation. So Charlie, I want to go to you, but I also want to hear from others on the panel on this particular topic.
Sure. I'm suddenly feeling defensive because I'm a man. I mean, my experience on this is actually I think there has been a generational shift. And I think when you look at sort of the parents, the new parents of today, the burden of care is much more evenly spread than it has been in the past. So I think that's beginning to feed through, along with the whole millennial changes that organisations are slowly adapting to. And I think organisations are, in their various ways, responding to that. Coming back to the language point that you talked about earlier, one of the things we did in my previous firm was to ban the phrase work-life balance. And the reason for that is work-life balance is not achievable in any of the jobs any of us do. I mean, if you want to have a 9-to-5 job, you can go and get a 9-to-5 job. But we replaced it with the phrase work-life fit, which felt more honest, because of course nobody can get an equal balance between their domestic life and their home life. So fitting your home life into your work life is actually how we all operate, and technology allows that. And that obviously feeds into how you can split the caring, you know, whether it's a child or whether it's an elderly parent or whatever it is. And if you're, you know, there are not many industries these days that actually require you to be at the desk, you know, throughout the day. You can be just as effective. And the equivalent one was we also tried to ban the phrase working from home, because working from home, of course, means, you know, something else, and call it remote working. And these little things can nudge the organisation, I think, in the direction it needs to go.
It's interesting, to that point about parenting. I lead our wholesale banking coverage in the UK for Egan Zender, so I'm extremely close to investment bankers. And you may have heard the statistics that, you know, everybody starts at par when you graduate university, and there is no pay gap. There is no pay gap. There is this. It's wonderful until women decide to have kids. Okay, and I cannot tell you, sadly, how many cases I've had of fantastically successful, smart, high potential, everything that works women who were penalized, not consciously and not on purpose at all, but they were left behind because they had to step away and have kids and come back. And there is a business explanation for that, because the bankers were saying, well, for 9 months, you know, while she was off, her other colleagues, male and female, were running deals, were you know, bringing in fees, they were in the market, they were active. Unfortunately, she wasn't, okay? But here, you know, her job is still safe and everything. That's not enough. That's not enough. And that's where sponsorship and mentorship, someone who, when it's time to split up the pie, say, well, yeah, she was out, but she was out for a really good reason. And, you know, we know how good she was in the past, and we have every reason to believe that she'll continue to be good when she's back, and that she won't be distracted, and all those biases that and stereotypes that come with a new parent, unfortunately. Yeah. And that's how they fall behind, and that's how they get disengaged, and that's how they say, especially in big, very expensive cities, raising kids in London, I'm raising 2 young ones right now. And a lot of people I know say, well, why work and pay my salary for the childcare? Well, I may as well stay home and look after my kids while they're still young. And then, of course, there's another problem. All right, how do you re-enter the workplace? But let's, you know, that's a big other fat
right. But that's also, even in organizations where men are offered paternity leave, there's studies after studies show that they don't take it because of that very reason, because they've seen their female colleagues have minimized opportunities going forward. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that a couple of things. On mentorship, sorry, we moved on from that. I need to stress that it's quite important to have diverse mentors, you know, have a female mentor, but actually if power and money is gendered, and it is gendered still, well, it makes sense actually to find somebody who is in that position to tell you how to do that. And there are very many willing men who would actually, I think in every organization, that would like to pair with. And we also can grow different type of leaders, because diversity is not only an ethical thing to do, which it is, I think, but it's also a good practice. I mean, especially in the future economy, we are just going to need creativity, and creativity comes from actually thinking outside of the box. So that's one case. But just going back to this policies that organizations can adopt to actually make the places more human-friendly, I would say, not even family-friendly, human-friendly, because many men want to take care of their kids. Come on, it's not just women thing, I think, right? So places that are kind of family-friendly are also better places to work, generally speaking. So it's something, and there are technologies today that actually, you know, can help us not to apply this presenteeism culture, right? Which is kind of an important strategy, small but can work. And the final point, and I'm finishing on that, is actually regarding the gender pay gap. Unfortunately, unfortunately, for every profession, even if you account for childcare, even if you talk about women who don't have family responsibilities, there is a gender pay gap. It starts from day one, and it decreases for women until their 35th year, yeah? And after that it grows. So for women under 35, we have 90% to $1, right? Women for the same job, for the same hours worked, for the same seniority level. And then, actually, after the age of 40, we have between 75 and 80%. So it's something really, really we need to still keep in mind. It's a complex issue, but it's an important one.
When you say those figures, I think, is it the lack of transparency? Are people not aware? Because we know them in the aggregate at this level, we can see that disparity. But in the weeds, in the actual corporations, why are women being so silent and taking this?
Well, first of all, there's no transparency. We just don't know who is earning what, right? So one very classic policy is to increase transparency, how money is calculated, and the people are aware, actually, who is earning what. Because when people become aware, well, they don't take it so gladly. So number one. Well, the second thing, even my students, like 19-year-olds, right? When I ask them, why do you think do we have a gender pay gap? And you know what answers I get? And it's a top business school. Because women are not that much interested. I said, what? How about me? Oh, no, you're a professor. No, but genuinely speaking, so stereotyping is still very, very strong, that women are interested in other things. Yes, some women are. Some men are too interested in other things. So I think this is very important, and it's a multi-level thing. We need to start early on. It's of course, it's law. Law is very important, but organizational cultures, how the laws are translated. What type of leaders do we want to have? People who actually, I don't know, work 18 hours a day. Who can be productive for 18 hours a day?
I mean, can I say, it sort of comes back a little bit, I'm afraid, to my hobby horse. I mean, in the end, leadership of an organisation is helping manage the selfish gene in all of us at the we level, at the individual level, and leveraging it for the benefit of the organisation as a whole. And whether it's gender or whether it's pay and bonuses or whatever it is, the organisation's systems produce the culture. Culture is not top-down. Culture is not personal chemistry or individual behaviour. Because we're human, we're driven by incentives. And I think it keeps coming back to that. So, actually going to your example, which of course we're familiar with the mother going off and coming back. I mean, she's not better because she's missed out on 9 months or a year of time. She's got a fantastically different experience. And we know for certain, in my world, if you turn up to a client to pitch for business with 4 white men, you get laughed out. And so you should. So you have to keep coming back to the systems.
Let's stay on the system for a minute, because I think when we look at what Marianna just said, so on the way in, there's probably equal representation across both men and women at junior levels. Then you see a dramatic fallout. The more senior you get in an organization, the fewer women are represented. So isn't there something about the performance appraisal and promotion system, which is so rooted in that straight white male paradigm, that somehow women are not escalating through it, right?
I agree with that. And we were talking earlier, one example, we had a group when we were looking at the annual partner promotion round, and there were 5 candidates, and these were all senior associates, so great lawyers, great people. Of the 5 candidates, there were 4 women and 1 man. And the group went away and they put up the man for partnership. This was 7 or 8 years ago. So we went back to them and we said, look, we would really like more female partners. Can you have a think again? And a week later, they said, we really thought about it and we still want the man. So, organisations, there is a male bias. Most organisations were actually designed by men 50, 100 years ago. So there's no surprise that there is this inbuilt culture, which to some extent are a bit of a mystery to women. And that's why you keep coming back to actually having to have incentives and accountability and rules in place to overcome, the challenges that this debate has illustrated over the years and the lack of progress.
But also, you mentioned leadership a couple of times. That's the make or break, okay? Because culture is very much set both at the top and at the bottom. And the only person responsible for that is the actual leader of the organization, okay? And the board that surrounds and appoints this leader, frankly. And like we said, it's fantastic that there has been steady and good progress on the board level. And I could come back to that about, what works best. And, we believe in the power of at least three females on boards. But before we go there, it's very interesting that now the stereotype of a leader, of what a leader should look like, or how he or she should be acting, is shifting. We want leaders. Our clients are actively looking for leaders who are more personable, who look out for, who confidently express their own personalities, and they don't fit into that mold. There are some movies of the 80s where, you have Michael Douglas and, that's the male stereotype of a leader. It's not. There are some people for whom that is indeed their personality and their style, and that's absolutely fine. But there are so many more flavors, and some of the most important, if not the most important work we are doing in coaching these top leaders is to allow them to identify what their personal leadership style is all about, okay, and to embrace it. And 3, which is, big wishful thinking, is, not just embrace it, but proudly leads by it, okay? And that invariably invites people to be themselves, to not try to mold themselves into this biased version of it. And unfortunately, there are some women who still want to position themselves as the macho male stereotype that they were brought up with. That sort of picture, that sort of icon, that prototype, which is so sad because, bye-bye diversity.
And do you think, Charlotte, that's generational? Do you find that the millennial generation that's now in the workplace, which I think wants to align their personal value system with the organization's, do you think that's dissipating what Lula was talking about?
I think, it's about winning the hearts and minds of the organisation. I think that is really true. I think the younger generation, it's slightly different because, the people that they come into work every day around it is much more diverse and much more inclusive than it has been. They're working in global organisations, culturally, it's all very different, I think we need to do a better job of bringing that up the levels and having, having that. And I think what you're saying is, let's not kind of fall into a trap of this is how I think I should behave and this is how I should go out to the business. It's about being you and having that voice about being you. And I think that's really important, which is going back to that voice and who are you and that voice of being able to raise that within the business. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Lula, do you think across your client base, if we were to give the audience some specific tactical things they can do, anything that jumps to mind that some organizations are doing quite well in this space?
So there are more organizations doing well today than they were in the past, which is wonderful, Obviously the wish, the aspiration is that everybody gets there. Advice, what to look for. Be yourselves. Get someone who has your back. And also having your back means giving you really nice raw feedback when you need it. Mm-hmm. Which is extremely important for us. And there are some cultures that are more averse to it than others. So, telling the hard truth sometimes speaks volumes and really, really helps. But at the same time, each one has a responsibility, from the 22-year-old analyst to the chair of the board. Everyone needs to take this for granted, frankly. Let's not talk about it anymore. Let's just take this as a base and improve it, because I've got 2 young children. My son is 8, my daughter is 7. I would hate it if in 15 years' time, 20 years' time, when my kids are in the workplace, that they come to me and they say, oh, well, my son got a real great job and he's getting paid than my daughter, and so on. That it means we've all failed.
Yeah. And I think at Finastra, what we've done is, as you look at kind of our vision and our mission over the next couple of years, we've very much pulled the inclusion piece into that, and that it goes out to the whole organisation. They have their corporate goals and objectives against that. We talk about what we're going to be doing, what teams are going to be involved in that. So it's connecting the whole dots around it, and so that everyone understands it and knows it, and people are accountable to deliver. And I think that's been really key for us.
And Charlie, when you think so the tools we have, right, they're going to fall into either a carrot or a stick. And it seems that we use carrot so much in this space. Is there any kind of stick idea you have that
yes.
way?
I mean, I've got a slightly different nuance, actually, because I think it's more that the debate has been going on a long time. Everybody is clear about the argument. Everybody is clear about the outcome they want. And what we've struggled to do is actually to implement it. So, I mean, going back to a comment I made earlier, I mean, I do think that the culture of an organisation is the outcome of its systems. It is not just personal chemistry. It is not actually just tone from the top. Tone from the top matters because A, underwrites and supports the culture, and also the top is the bit that puts in place the systems. So the right attitude at the top is critical. But for the last few years, I can't see any way through this actually without rules. And I'm a believer in the organisation developing its rules rather than it being imposed by legislation. Because all organisations, you have to get it there at its own pace with a bit of encouragement. And I think imposing legislation could have a backlash. But with the right leadership, putting in place the right systems, you can get to a place where you have quotas. And it is that simple point. When faced with two candidates, you stop talking about who is best and you look inside the organisation and say, what do we need?
Right. I think by the time you're down to the final two candidates, there's such a small difference in skill set, right?
Exactly.
It's likely.
Exactly.
So you have youth in your hands as part of your job, right? So what would you advise, not only the women, because I think it's just as important for the men, young men, to have a different expectation. I mean, what is the advice you would give your class on entering the workforce and navigating it?
Thank you very much, Richard, for saying that gender is about men and women, not just women. and that's exactly where I would start in giving advice to my students, not giving advice, letting them to actually articulate that rather than me talking to them. And I think it's about sharing our resources. Our planet is becoming increasingly smaller, the resources become increasingly limited, so it's about fairer sharing of our resources, I would say. And since actually leadership, money, and status is about power, just actually sharing that power. So I would support what Charlie says. We need proactive policies. I know quota, get people excited, but I would say we need proactive policies from management, at the level of legislation, at the level of leadership, but from managers as well. At the end of the day, managers implement organizational policies as well as people themselves. So, people who feel underrepresented, they should also become more proactive as well. So I think that women have also a role to play in actually trying to learn the tricks of the trade together with men within organizations.
There's quite a nice line somebody gave me a while ago. People often think that Darwin talked about the survival of the fittest. He didn't. He said it's not the strongest that survive, it's not the fittest, or indeed it's not the most intelligent that survive, it's the most adaptable to change.
Absolutely.
And if you think about that from an organisational point of view, and then the great quote that actually somebody in your world gave me was that Darwinism needs a nudge at the moment.
That's great. So we have a few minutes left, and I wanted to save some time for any questions from the audience to make this more participative. Is there anyone right here in the front? Yes.
So,
Wait for the microphone coming.
recently in New York City, they have put a compensation ban on the when candidates are transferring around, at least in the financial space. You can't disclose your prior comp, and they've done this to try to equalize pay across specific seats. Some organizations have gone global with this, while legally they're not obligated to. And I think that's been a useful tool for women to equalize pay with men across at least specific levels. Is this something that, other firms are thinking about kind of taking on without the legality around it? Because currently it's only a rule for New York City specifically.
Well, in California. So there's some, right. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's too early to tell what the effects of that are. We know that when we have global projects, for example, because in Europe it's still fair game, frankly, and actually in Europe you have, in some cases, regulators who come in and say, ooh, how come you're giving this person a 20% rise from his previous job or from her previous job? So, that's the flip side of it. It's early, let's see where it goes. Is it fair? Absolutely, it's fair. Usually they come up with side ways of finding out other things, and if you want to nudge it and you want to influence it, you can. But let's see, why not? Yeah, it's a watch this space kind of situation. It's very new. It's only a year old or something. Yeah.
Yes.
Right, so I've just recently relocated to London for a partner, and thanks to Egon Zender, I was just placed in a senior role at a leading venture capital firm here. And part of just hearing sort of the resources around being proactive and adapt to change, are there any recommendations just locally in London in terms of organizations like Level 20, which I've heard about, which have mentoring programs? Like, how can I actually take control of my career going forward and sort of leverage some of the other women who've been successful?
Oh, it's me? Yes, is the answer. There are different flavors. I mean, it's a big market, which is fantastic, and you need to find something that works best for you. Level 20 is a great idea. It's a great initiative. I think it's you need to ask what you want to get out of it, and then on the back of that, go shopping for the different things that exist in the market. And I personally believe extremely strongly on that sponsorship thing. Make sure that you have someone internally who cares for you and who will have the tough conversation with you or with others about you. And then if you want to expand that and so on, that's great. That's a luxury. That's a nice to have. The must have is your immediate circle.
Can I do a quick plug for one organisation which is called the Mentoring Foundation, which was set up by a woman called Penina Thompson about 10 or 15 years ago. And it was originally set up for the chairman of FTSE 100 companies to mentor senior women in other FTSE 100 companies. Because I do think mentoring works better if you're in different organisations, because it removes the conflict. That has since expanded into professional services and private equity and other industries. So for anybody in this room who's interested in it, I know they're keen to acquire more organisations where you get the leader of your firm to become a mentor of other firms, not necessarily in your sector, and somebody in your firm becomes a mentee. And I think it's been proved to be very successful.
Mm-hmm. Another point I want to follow up on what you said and what Lulu said before is this notion of feedback. So over my career, I had chaired the Diversity Council at Citi, and one of the things I would try to do is do exit interviews as diverse candidates were leaving. And one very talented young African-American guy was leaving, and I wanted to understand why. And his response was a little surprising. He said, I'm a relatively junior person here, and yet everything I do seems to be terrific, whereas my colleagues seem to get much more criticism on their work. So I feel that you're robbing me of the opportunity to learn because you're afraid to tell me when I've done something wrong. And I think that is always been a great lesson for me. And those of you in the room that work for me know I have no problem giving direct feedback, but I think it's important because it's how you shape someone and help them grow. Otherwise, they're stifled at where they are. Right? But I think as our workforce becomes more diverse, sometimes hiring managers are afraid to give that feedback. So if you're in that pool here, don't be. Any other questions?
Oh, absolutely. And can I just only say, it's about diverse people, but about equivalent people, which they are of the same value. They are diverse, different, but of the same value. And giving feedback, it's a gift.
That's right.
But I spoke about our potential model earlier, the need for potential, how we solve the lack of actual candidates who tick all the boxes based on the potential, based on our assessment of their potential. Our potential is based on 4 pillars: determination, insight, which is how you make decisions, engagement, and most importantly, curiosity. So the biggest compliment an Egon Zehnder consultant will ever pay you is to say, "Ooh, wow, you're curious, that's great." And curiosity for us breaks down to learning, your attitude to learning, your attitude to change, and feedback. That's it. So if you take feedback out of the equation, it means that by definition, your curiosity as a parameter is going to be, lesser of what it should be, okay? Which means that your overall potential is not going to be as high, which means that your chance of being placed as an amazing new candidate with new executive with a bright future ahead of you is also compromised. Ask for feedback, give feedback, be open to feedback.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes, sir. There's a mic coming. Okay. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Very much. Hi there, thank you very much. I was just wondering, we're talking a lot about women in the workplace currently, but actually by the time women come to the workplace, we've already undermined their ability to do jobs and be treated fairly. I grew up as a loud Glaswegian opinionated guy, as did my sister, not guy, but my little sisters grew up as loud and opinionated as well. They were taught early on that they were being bossy. I get taught early on that I'm being the boss. So when my sister and I look at the same application, we're both equally qualified. I'll go for the job if I've got 80% of the credentials and she won't. How can we address that before people even come to the workplace? And is there a role for business to do that?
Okay. Well, can I just say, early on, from kindergarten, actually, there is a research which suggests that when you ask US children in the kindergarten at the age of 7, around 7, right, a bit later, how many of them want to become presidents of the US? You have 50-50. By the age of 16, you have 80-20. You understand who is 80 and who is 20, right? I don't have to say. So the way we talk and the way we actually help young people to imagine themselves actually in different, to fulfill their potential, we benefit as a society. People are happier. So we benefit in many, many ways, actually. And it's a better world for both men and women. I just want to emphasize, because not every guy wants to be a leader, no? That's another issue to be borne in mind. And there's a big pressure on men to be those macho type of leader as well.
Can I just say, yeah. I mean, this issue of confidence, I've always struggled with. I mean, as all the men in this room know, we lack just as much confidence as any women do. We manage to disguise it a bit, but every one of us, lacks confidence. And in fact, when you take it again down to the practicalities, if you're interviewing for a job and you look at 2 people, and one is sort of confident and brash and a bit loud, and the other one is a bit more thoughtful, a bit more hesitant, a little bit more self-doubt, we all know which one we're going to hire. It's obvious, because you don't want the loud, noisy, overconfident person in your organisation. You want the thoughtful one. And I think it's quite important to remember that, because you're right, you often hear, the man says, I can do 10% of the list, so I'll go for it, and the woman doesn't. And I don't know what the answer to that is, other than just remembering some of those things.
Okay, so we are just about out of time. We began, and I told you some kind of odd statistics and facts, so I'll leave you with another one that I think also comes from government that is a little bit more optimistic. So in the last US presidential campaign, Hillary Clinton made the comment that her mother was born before women had the right to vote in the United States, and her daughter just voted for her mother to be president of the United States. So change can happen, but we have to be quite deliberate about it. So thank you all for coming. And